Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover the primary principles of hypertrophy training and how different training variables can be manipulated to maximize muscle growth. The first and most important training variable for muscle growth is proximity to failure. This refers to how close each set is taken to the point where no more reps can be performed. This is usually quantified using the reps in reserve, or RIR for short, or the rate of perceived exertion, or RPE for short, scales. These are simple numerical scales where trainees subjectively rate how many reps they think they could have performed before failure. 0 reps in reserve or an RPE of 10 means that no more reps could have been performed in that set. 1 rep in reserve or an RPE of 9 means that 1 more rep could have been performed. 2 reps in reserve or an RPE of 8 means that 2 more reps could have been performed, and so on. So how close to failure should we train to maximize muscle growth? To understand this, we need to have a look at the size principle of motor unit recruitment. Essentially, each muscle is composed of many different muscle fibers. Some of these are smaller and weaker fibers that are more resistant to fatigue, which are termed slow twitch muscle fibers. Other fibers are bigger and stronger, but have poor endurance capabilities, which are termed fast twitch muscle fibers. When we lift a weight, the slow twitch muscle fibers are always recruited first. So if the weight is light enough, only the slow twitch fibers are used to lift the weight initially. The fast twitch muscle fibers are only recruited when they are required. So if the weight is very heavy, then more fast twitch fibers are required because the slow twitch fibers can't lift the weight alone. However, even with lighter loads, the closer we take the set to failure, the more muscle fibers that will be recruited. This is because the slow twitch fibers fatigue and can no longer lift the weight alone. So the bigger and stronger fibers kick in to assist until all muscle fibers are involved. This research review concluded that heavier loads in the 6 to 12 rep range seem to recruit all muscle fibers from very early in the set and therefore don't need to be taken as close to failure to maximize muscle hypertrophy. Although lighter loads in higher rep ranges should be taken around 0 to 2 reps in reserve to fully stimulate the highest threshold motor units. A practical guideline would be to take sets in the 6 to 12 rep range around 1 to 3 reps before failure, and sets in the 12 to 20 plus rep range around 0 to 2 reps before failure. The next important variable for hypertrophy training is the rep ranges and load used for each set. Reps performed and the load used have an inverse relationship. This means that the heavier the load is, the less reps that can be performed and vice versa. Since the load used is highly individual to the strength level of each trainee and each exercise, it is generally best to use reps performed to determine load, as this can be applied to every single exercise for every single trainee. So what rep ranges are best for muscle growth? This meta-analysis concluded that hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a spectrum of loads and rep ranges, provided that each set is taken close to failure. So the exact number of reps performed doesn't actually matter to any significant extent as long as sets are taken close to failure. This is because regardless of the load used, all muscle fibers will eventually be recruited and trained, as we discussed earlier in the video. However, some exercises are generally better suited to using higher rep ranges, while others are better suited to using lower rep ranges. Generally speaking, compound lifts which require other accessory muscles for stability are usually best suited to the lower rep ranges with heavier loads. This is because lots of muscle groups are working simultaneously, which means that the cardiovascular system or accessory muscles may fatigue and limit performance before the target muscle with higher rep ranges. In opposition, isolation lifts with low stability demands are generally better suited to the higher rep ranges with lighter loads. This is because the load is concentrated on one specific joint, which means heavy loads will place high stresses on a single joint, which unnecessarily increases injury risk. Furthermore, isolation lifts won't be limited by the cardiovascular system or fatigue of other muscle groups. As a practical guideline, primary compound lifts with high stability demands are best suited to the 6 to 12 rep range, while lighter isolation lifts with low stability demands are best suited to the 12 to 20 plus rep range. The next principle of hypertrophy training is volume. Volume refers to how much total work is performed over a certain period of time. Because hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a spectrum of different rep ranges and loads, this systematic review suggested that volume for hypertrophy training can be quantified using the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. This is because each set within the 6 to 20 rep range taken fairly close to failure essentially provides an equivalent hypertrophy stimulus. So how much volume is best for muscle growth? There is debate as to how much volume results in optimal muscle growth, and we still don't fully understand the relationship between volume and hypertrophy. Generally, the research shows that higher volumes result in more muscle growth. This meta-analysis demonstrated that there was a dose-response relationship between weekly volume and muscle growth. In other words, the more volume trainings performed, the more muscle growth they saw. And notably, this study found that this dose-response relationship continued with volumes as high as 45 weekly sets per muscle group. So it certainly seems that volume is the primary driver of hypertrophy, and more volume results in greater muscle growth. However, most of these studies are only short-term training protocols around 4 to 8 weeks in length. From a practical standpoint, using very high volumes for extended periods of time may cause trainees to run into some issues. First is the injury risk associated with higher volumes. Depending on the muscle group and joints involved, high volumes may simply tax the joints and connective tissue too much over time, resulting in pain and irritation, even if the muscle is still able to recover and grow from the volume. While this may not be an issue for short-term training protocols, performing very high volumes for multiple months may breach the recovery capacity of these tissues. The second issue is our systemic fatigue. There is only so much volume that can be recovered from over a certain period of time, and breaching this will probably result in performance reductions or illness. High volumes can be tolerated for short periods of time as systemic fatigue accumulates over multiple weeks and months. So high volumes for extended periods of time may result in an overtrained state. And the last practical problem is that there is an individual variation between trainees, muscle groups, and where you are in your lifting career. So high volumes for one trainee may be different for another trainee. So what can we practically conclude regarding volume for muscle growth? We still don't fully understand the relationship between volume and hypertrophy, and more research is needed to get a better idea. However, my practical recommendations would be to perform as much volume as possible that allows you to recover from a systemic standpoint and doesn't cause any joint irritation over time. It should be noted that we are referring to such volume that can be consistently performed over multiple months, not just for a few weeks. The volume we allocate to each muscle group can also be adjusted based on what our preferences are. So muscle groups that we want to emphasize should use higher volumes, while less volume can be allocated to muscle groups that the trainee doesn't particularly want to emphasize. So each individual needs to experiment with different volumes for different muscle groups and see what they can recover adequately from. The next principle of hypertrophy training is frequency. Frequency refers to how many times per week a muscle group is trained. It should be understood that frequency is simply a way of distributing volume throughout the week. So whenever we discuss different frequencies, we are assuming that weekly volume is equated. Therefore, a higher frequency means less per session volume, while lower frequency means more per session volume. Training frequency probably doesn't have any significant impact on muscle growth. This meta-analysis concluded that there was no noticeable differences in muscle growth when training a muscle group 1 to 3 or more days per week, when volume was equated. However, there did seem to be a slight trend in favor of higher frequencies compared to training a muscle group once per week, although this was not significant. One reason that higher frequencies may potentially have slightly superior effects than lower frequencies is due to the ability to train with higher quality. What this means is that when we train a muscle group multiple times per week, we can perform each set in a less fatigued state. If we perform all our weekly volume in one session, then by the end of the session, that particular muscle group will be highly fatigued and cannot produce as many reps or lift as heavy a load as if it was in a non-fatigued state. This would allow more total mechanical tension to be experienced by the muscle in each set, potentially resulting in a greater muscle growth response. So what can we practically conclude with regards to frequency for muscle growth? First and foremost, frequency doesn't make much of a difference when total volume is equated. However, if we want to ensure that hypertrophy gains are maximized, it is probably best to train each muscle group at least 2 times per week. Furthermore, while frequency may not have much impact when volume is equated, increasing frequency can be an effective way to accumulate more total volume throughout the week. Beyond these vague recommendations, trainees can implement a frequency based on personal preference. The next principle of hypertrophy training is exercise selection. This refers to what exercises are chosen to train each muscle group. While there is no best exercise for any muscle group, there are certainly some factors we should consider when selecting exercises for a hypertrophy program. The first factor to consider is the stimulus to fatigue ratio. This refers to how effective the exercise is at stimulating muscle hypertrophy compared to how much systemic fatigue it induces. For hypertrophy training, we want to select the exercises which produce the greatest hypertrophy stimulus for the lowest systemic fatigue cost. For example, a high bar squat probably has a better stimulus to fatigue ratio for the quads than a low bar squat. This is because the high bar squat takes the quads through a greater range of motion, places lower demands on other muscles and joints, and doesn't require as much load. In comparison, a low bar squat involves less range of motion for the quads, more tension on the glutes, hamstrings, and spinal erectors, and uses more absolute load than the high bar squat. The second factor to consider is how many exercises should be implemented for each individual muscle group. This is individual to each muscle based on its individual anatomy. Muscles which have fibers spanning in different directions and produce more than one movement generally need more than one exercise to maximally tax all fibers, while muscles which only produce one movement and have most fibers spanning in the same direction can probably be maximized with only one exercise. For example, the chest performs multiple different movements and the muscle fibers run in different directions. Therefore, it may be best to perform a flat pressing exercise, an incline pressing exercise, and a fly variation to maximize growth of all fibers. In contrast, the calf muscles probably only need one calf raise variation, as all of the muscle fibers will be trained with a simple plantar flexion exercise. Here are some general recommendations of how many exercises are required for the primary muscle groups to maximize muscle growth. As we can see here, the more complex muscles which have fibers traveling in different directions and perform multiple different movements can generally benefit from including more exercises. And the last primary consideration for exercise selection is individual variation and personal preference. Some people are more or less suited to different exercises based on their individual anatomical makeup. There can be significant variation between individuals' bone structure, tendon insertions, and muscle fiber striation direction. This may make some exercises more or less suitable for different trainees. Furthermore, most trainees have specific exercises that they prefer over others. So if two exercises are similarly effective in the muscle groups they train, the individual can simply select the exercise that they enjoy more. The next principle of hypertrophy training is lifting technique. Similar to exercise selection, there is no universal optimal lifting technique. However, there are some factors we should consider with regards to how we perform each exercise for the goal of maximum muscle hypertrophy. The first consideration is range of motion. When training for muscle growth, we generally want to always use full range of motion. This systematic review concluded that full range of motion results in greater muscle growth compared with partial range for the lower body, but there was conflicting evidence for the upper limbs. So while it seems clear that the full range of motion is more beneficial for leg growth, it may be that the arms can achieve equal hypertrophy gains using full or partial range of motion. Even if this is the case, full range of motion is probably still more effective than partial range. This is because we have some evidence that active stretch under load seems to be somewhat hypertrophic. This research review suggested that stretch under load between muscle contractions seems to result in muscle hypertrophy. This suggests that if we perform resistance training through a full range of motion, the active stretch under load at the end of the range may be more hypertrophic compared with partial range. The next technique consideration is what muscles are the limiting factor of each set. We want to perform each lift in a way that allows the target muscles to become the limiting factor. In other words, if we hit failure, the target muscle should be the factor that fails, not other assistance muscles. A big part of this is using strict technique, but there are also other factors involved. Some indicators that we can use to assess if we actually train the muscles we were targeting are the mind-muscle connection and muscle soreness the following day. The specific technique used for any given exercise is highly specific to the individual. Each trainee should find what technique variations provide the best training response for them. For example, a trainee may perform a seated cable row with strict technique, but the technique they use doesn't really tax the back muscles. Instead, the arms become the limiting factor and the back muscles don't receive much of a hypertrophy stimulus. The next technique consideration for hypertrophy training is strictness. This refers to the amount of movement from other muscles and joints compared with the target muscle. In almost all cases, the stricter the technique is, the better. This means only producing movement from the target muscles and relevant joints without any movement from other joints. Strict technique is probably most effective for two primary reasons. First is that we want all the tension to be placed directly on the target muscles. This will mean that the target muscles are doing all the work to lift the weight, and the adaptations take place specifically where we want it to. Producing movement from other muscle groups simply takes the tension off the target muscle and places more stress on other muscles and joints. This means that the target muscle isn't receiving the best possible hypertrophic stimulus. The second reason we want to use strict technique is to minimize systemic fatigue. Using strict technique usually requires less load to be lifted than if technique is sloppy. This will induce less systemic fatigue than if we stick with a lighter load and use strict form. So strict technique will maximize the stimulus to fatigue ratio of each set. And the last primary technique consideration to maximize muscle growth is to control the eccentric portion of the lift. This doesn't mean the eccentric portion of the lift needs to be intentionally slowed down, it just means that the muscle should be working eccentrically in some way rather than letting gravity do the work. This meta-analysis concluded that both concentric and eccentric muscle actions are effective at inducing muscle growth. So if this is the case, then why should the eccentric portion be controlled at all? The reason for this is because the eccentric portion is more work that the muscle could have performed. So if the eccentric portion is not controlled, then we are simply not doing half the work we could have been doing. And the last primary principle of hypertrophy training is rest periods between sets. It is not entirely clear what length of rest periods are best for muscle growth. This systematic review concluded that both long and short rest intervals are both effective at producing muscle hypertrophy, although there was a slight trend for longer rest intervals to be superior. So why do rest intervals have minimal effect on hypertrophy outcomes? This study concluded that shorter rest periods induce greater metabolic stress, while absolute load lifted benefits more from longer rest periods. So there seems to be a spectrum here. On one side we have longer rest intervals. Longer rest intervals allow fatigue to dissipate and each set to be of higher quality. This means that the mechanism of mechanical tension is maximized because we can either lift more load with each set or lift the same load for more repetitions. On the other side of the spectrum, we have shorter rest periods. Shorter rest intervals don't allow as much fatigue to dissipate. Although the quality of each set may not be as high, shorter rest periods maximize metabolic stress, another mechanism of hypertrophy. So regardless of if the trainee rests longer or shorter, if each set is taken fairly close to failure, then the hypertrophic response will probably be similar. However, it does appear that longer rest periods may have a slight advantage over short rest periods. The amount of rest allowed between sets may also be influenced by a few different factors. First, the exercise itself may influence the length of our interset rest periods. Some exercises may be better suited to longer rest periods, while others are usually best suited to using shorter rest periods. Generally, heavy compound lifts should allow longer rest periods so that the cardiovascular system and accessory muscles are given enough time to fully recover. Otherwise, if they are still fatigued, they may prematurely limit performance before the target muscles. On the other hand, isolation lifts may be better off suited to shorter rest periods, since they won't be limited by fatigue of central systems or any other accessory muscles. The order of the exercises may also influence how long we rest between sets. Generally, the exercises performed earlier in the training session should use longer rest periods so that the muscles aren't excessively metabolically fatigued for the rest of the session. However, the exercises performed last in the training session may use shorter rest periods since there are no additional exercises to perform next. This can maximize mechanical tension earlier in the training session and take advantage of the metabolic stress mechanism for the exercises at the end of the session. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.